Hello everybody. Today's topic is application breakpoint testing. It's a type of testing in PSR. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jyotirmayi Pola. I'm working as a performance engineering architect in an MNC in Bangalore. I have over 22 years of experience when this video was created. I've worked in various domains like telecom, healthcare, banking, insurance, defense, and now in this latest stint, I've got an opportunity to work in aeronautics, buildings, and industrial domains as well. I've worked extensively on PSR and have experience on application, OS, hardware, and network tuning. Let's talk about what is an application breakpoint testing. So, to start with, PSR testing or performance tests are actually done both in a positive way and as in a negative way. How are they actually bifurcated into positive and negative? Let's see. Let's talk about, say, load testing. When you do a load test, or when you do an endurance test, or when you do a stress test, or when you do any other types of testing, say failover testing, the idea basically is your application is absolutely not going to go down. It may go down momentarily, but you're thinking positively and you're assuming positively that the application will bounce back. And there is a small period when the application may go down or some errors may be thrown, but the application gets bounced back to its normal state. In breakpoint testing, you are actually breaking the application. It's like a piece of glass. When you break it, it's broken. So it's a negative type of testing. So there is no coming back of the application once you actually break them. So application breakpoint testing is one of the negative testing that can be done on any applications. And how do you actually do the application breakpoint testing and why do you do it? Let's talk about why we do it. Now we want to identify where the application or the hardware or resources on which the application sits is going to break. We want to see the behavior of, say, the response times or the server stats or the network or whatever is the measurement criteria that we have for doing the breakpoint testing. How is the application behaving? Or how is the hardware behaving? How are the server stats behaving? And say, for example, if it is a multi-component, and there are multiple microservices in your application, or it is multiple applications with lots of microservices sitting together as a one big application, which one of those systems or which one of those microservices or which one of those components are failing first? And when do they start failing? The whole application may not be failed. May not have failed yet, but there is one component which fails. One of the microservices is throwing errors, and there is a second component or a microservice which may be starting to throw errors, maybe a little at a little higher load than what the first component failed. So the analysis about breakpoint, or the whole entire purpose or the crux of breakpoint testing, is to understand what fails first. Why is it failing first? Whereas the second one which is failing is still not failed. There may be a component or a couple of microservices or an application. If it's a bigger application with multiple applications, there may be one application which is too stable even after the entire application went down. Why is that? So the understanding of this kind of behavior of the application or the server resources or the OS or the threads at the OS level or the network is called breakpoint testing. And when you actually analyze and figure out why and what happened during the breakpoint time or just before the breakpoint and after the breakpoint, tuning your application for a better breakpoint or to handle the existing breakpoint is what is the end result of a breakpoint testing test. Now, having said that, there is no pass criteria because it's a negative testing. So you're breaking the system and you already know that it is a negative test where you're going to break the system. So there is nothing called pass or fail for this kind of a test. It's not a load test that your SLA is met, so it passed. It's not an endurance test that wherein I'm putting a burn-in test for 7 days and the application was working fine after 7 days, so it's pass. So application breakpoint testing is you're failing it. You already are doing a negative test. So there is no criteria called pass or fail for this kind of a testing. Now let's talk about how do you define a breakpoint for an application. Now application breakpoint is not always only on the software side. An application, in my terminology or in my words, I always say that software is not independent. It's a marriage between software as well as hardware. So your application is not independent. Your application is a combination of code or software, the hardware resources, that is the infrastructure, the network on which it is actually passing on the bits and bytes. It is the operating systems on which the software is sitting. It is the storage or file system on which your infrastructure resources are probably sitting. It is databases, cylinders on which the database is actually present. So the application breakpoint can be any of these points with which it is a combination where the combination is formed. It can be a breakpoint of any of these. Now, depending on what your application is, and depending on how your customer is going to use it, depending on what is the critical features that the customer is really looking for in your application, you need to be wise enough to create a criteria at which point, or what is the break point, at which point I will consider my application to be broken. So is it like the 95th percentile of a response time for an API? Or is it like if it's a full end-to-end application that you're testing a use case and one of the use cases, if it goes down, then I'm going to consider that it is a breakpoint of my application? Or is it like infrastructure or server stats like CPU utilization or memory utilization or the disk IO or file server reads or writes or any of the cylinders going bad? Are these your criteria for defining the breakpoint? It can also be the error profiles where you will actually say that I don't want 5xx errors. I don't want say I am OK with the 3xx and 4xx errors, but I do not want 5xx errors. So that's going to be my error profile. Or I want to actually print well-defined warning on my say my web page if it's a web page related application, and those errors are acceptable. How many errors are acceptable, or a percentage of errors that are acceptable or not acceptable? These all things define breakpoint. Now choose your breakpoint wisely, because you are defining, you're actually taking the position of a persona of a customer and really considering in real time what is my breakpoint. So let me give an example. OK, say very easy example that I would say. OK, so all of us use WhatsApp. Now, if I have to performance test a WhatsApp application on, say, Android mobiles, this is my criteria. Testing criteria. Now, if I have to define the application breakpoint for this kind of an application, what would be the main feature or the most used feature on WhatsApp? It's about texting on WhatsApp. It can be a one-on-one texting or it can be a group texting. That is my most important feature of WhatsApp. Then what is the next best feature? You send forwards. It can be images or videos or links or documents, right? This is your next best feature. What is third best feature? So now for me, if I'm saying, okay, let's for time purposes, I'm going to say that these are the only two features that I'm going to define breakpoint. So if I say that these two features and the microservices involved in these two features are going to work fine, then it's not a breakpoint. When if I'm sending a forward an image of 1 KB size in a WhatsApp group, I'm doing a it is a one-to-many, right? Because I'm sending it into a group and many people actually have to receive it at the same time. In this one-to-many scenario, when I'm sending one image of 1 KB size, if the 95th percentile response time under load is less than 10 milliseconds, it is good. If it is going to 10.1 milliseconds, that's my breakpoint, because this feature is actually the most critical feature of WhatsApp. Similarly, I can look at errors, I can look at log profiles, I can look at OS threads congestion, you can look at cache congestion. You can define any type of breakpoint. I have listed a couple, but that does not limit it to only the 4 that I have listed on the UI right now, on the presentation right now. So that's just one example. So always define your application breakpoint criteria very, very wisely. Choose it wisely. It's very important. That's what defines your breakpoint. That's what defines your entire application. The quality of your application, quality of service of your application. Now, how is breakpoint tested? I have, as I have explained just a few minutes ago, breakpoint testing is about failing your application altogether, your system under test. Now, how do I know that where it breaks, when it breaks, and how it breaks? I only have defined how or what is the breakpoint. Now here in this example, in this graph, for example, this is my breakpoint. I do not know how many users it breaks. So I will come up with the minimal users. If my application itself is going to say, I'm going to assume that my application is going to start at 10, going to break at 10 users, for example. So I will start with somewhere around 1 user. And at 1 user, I will start the test and I will keep on incrementing. I'll ramp it up till the application reaches 10 users, 11 users, or 12 users. So if I'm assuming that the 10 users is the breakpoint in this test, so once you keep on increasing, ramping up the number of users, it will break when it reaches 10. I may have an application which has a breakpoint of say 1000 users, and if I have started at 1 user, the time I have taken to reach 1000 users is going to be huge as compared to reaching at 10 users, which actually tells you that you cannot define the amount of time you will test. For example, I can say that I'm going to do a load test of 1 hour. I'm going to do a 48 hours of endurance test or 7 days of endurance test. Breakpoint test doesn't have time. You cannot tell that I will be doing 100 user test for 1 hour. This is my breakpoint testing. That is really absurd and invalid. You can actually say, I'm going to start my test with say 5 users or 10 users, and I'm going to ramp up 5 users per 5 seconds, or every second I'm going to ramp up by 10 users. Depending on what your assumption is, you'll start somewhere and you'll see where it breaks. And if you realize that the moment you have ramped up by 5 users, it immediately broke, which means your breakpoint is somewhere between 5 users and 10 users. When you realize that, you repeat the test by starting with 1 user and incrementing it 1 user at a time. That is very important because your whole analysis is around this breakpoint. What happened just before the breakpoint started? What happened right after that? And how did it deteriorate? Which component failed first? Which microservice failed first? How did it fail? Is it actually increasing the log size? Did it have a memory leak, or it's having a CPU leak, or it's actually doing a congestion, or it is keep on retrying and then it goes into a timeout? What happened? So that's what happened. Analysis happens here. So you need to go slow here. You need to know where it fails. This is the whole crux of breakpoint testing. Now, during breakpoint testing, of course, as the load keeps increasing, your response times will increase, and your CPU may increase, and at the time of breakpoint, it might fall down because your memory had congestion and there are no more transactions, so there is no CPU usage anymore. That's what I'm showing here. At this point, maybe I have reached a breakpoint where the memory is actually increasing and it's stuck here. Nothing is happening here, and everything fell down because there is the CPU, the memory is actually congestion. There is a congestion at the memory and no transactions are happening, and all the CPU fell down. It might raise again. This is a rough diagram that I have written just for explanation purposes. This is what is the analysis you need to do. This is how you need to test the breakpoint as such. Let's go to the next slide. A common mistake usually done by amateur performance engineers is to combine or use both breakpoint and stress test alternatively. Breakpoint and stress have actually have a difference between them. Breakpoint test, as the way I have explained till now, breakpoint test has a breakpoint. You define a point where the application is termed or deemed to be broken. You decide where the application is said to be broken, or the system under test is said to be broken. Whereas on a stress test, it's like chaos. You just keep on increasing the load and you will actually aim that you have reached an insane limit on the application where everything is failing. It can be gradual increase or it can be sudden spike. How you test it is different, but you don't have a break point. You don't determine that, okay, I'm going to say that 95th percentile of this API response time needs to be, say, 10 milliseconds. You don't have that definition. You just know everything goes for a toss and you wait or you ingest that kind of a chaos into the system under test and it fails completely. Nothing is responding anymore and you're just throwing everything at it. That's stress test. Breakpoint test has a definition. Stress test does not have a definition. Breakpoint test is also done in a gradual increasing of user load. Stress can also be done as a gradual increase of user load, or it can be a spiked load of all of a sudden for a limited amount of time. That does not matter. But breakpoint testing never has spikes. The application does not crash all the time. It can be a component or everything is still running with warnings and errors. You just have an acceptance criteria that I will accept like 1% of the errors and I do not accept beyond 1% of errors. But in stress test, there is nothing else but other errors. Maybe even if the application is so crashed out that it cannot even throw an error anymore. It's dead completely. That's the difference between breakpoint and stress. So kind request not to use breakpoint and stress alternatively. They are two different tests. Both needs to be done on an application. Yes. Both actually give you a different analysis. Yes. Both will give you a different tuning criteria to the application. Yes. But both are not the same. I hope I have explained it better. Thank you. So if you think that this video was useful, give me a like and a subscribe. Thank you.